Hello and welcome to this afternoon's Plus You conversation organized by Habitat for Humanity International. I'm Dave Keating, Brussels correspondent for France 24, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on housing options for refugees from Ukraine as winter approaches. Now, on Monday, the EU prolonged by 12 months the special protection status for Ukrainian refugees, extending their right to live, work, and receive benefits in any EU member state until March 2024. Ukraine's ambassador to the EU told reporters on Monday the move is necessary because there could be a new wave of Ukrainian people seeking protection in the EU following Russia's attacks on civilian targets throughout the country in the past days. The news that Belarus may send troops into Ukraine as well may provide further motivation for fleeing. Some 1.4 million Ukrainian refugees have been registered in Poland alone, followed by 709,000 in Germany and 442,000 in the Czech Republic. That's according to figures from the UN Refugee Agency. It's the largest displacement of refugees in Europe since the Second World War. All of that comes in addition to the 6.2 million people internally displaced within Ukraine, totaling around 14 million displaced. The living environment and conditions in terms of housing is key to the integration of refugees and migrants. But though the special protection status has been given at EU level, providing housing for the refugees is a responsibility of individual member states, and we've seen a wide variety of approaches. National, regional, and local government authorities are in charge with the assistance of non-governmental organizations. But for many asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants, the lack of adequate housing is an obstacle to integration into the receiving society. In addition, depending on their legal status, gender, civic status, or nationality, these particular groups face manifold barriers, especially financial and social disadvantages, to acquire decent housing. For many, housing is scarce, rents are high, living conditions are poor, and often the only neighborhoods available are deprived areas. Although there's been an outpouring of goodwill from the European public toward the Ukrainian refugees, not necessarily seen with previous waves, the reality is that Ukrainians are still encountering housing difficulties familiar to all refugees in Europe. With winter looming, soaring energy prices, and increased cost of living, the challenges are far-reaching and urgent for displaced people, especially when it comes to housing. So to start, we'd like to play a short video highlighting families from Ukraine displaced by this war. It's important to move past statistics and remember these are the voices of the families and others like them that we are talking about today. They are the fortunate ones who have secured housing with the help of cities such as Warsaw and organizations such as Habitat. Let's cue up that video.
У Польщі я намагаюся жити так, як я жила раніше. Маріуполь саме, де я мешкала там до війни. Коли ти в чужому місці, в чужій країні, ти дуже швидко житлове питання це закриваєш, це основне. Тобто ми відчуваємо, звичайно, що ми тут гості, але все ж таки комфортно.
А ми коли приїхали з України, нам не було де жити, і ми не знали, що робити. Ми в такому були відчаю. Ми не маємо змогу знімати житло, тим паче, як дитина особлива. Тут дуже затишно і гарно. Тут поруч є 3 парки, 3 дитячих майданчики, дуже багато магазинів. Тут навіть живуть українці, також ми з деякими познайомились.
В Рестории мы работаем водителями. Мы забираем мебель со склада, развозим ее нуждающимся беженцам. В этой работе в основном общаешься с украинцами, и это помогает и мне, и украинцам тоже.
Для мене, як для мами, я повинна зробити все, щоб мої діти себе почували комфортно. Це взагалі все нове. Нова школа для дітей, нові знання, і польська мова.
А тут я відчув, що ми в безпеці. І завдяки навіть цій квартирі, завдяки цій атмосфері, що тут, що не потрібно там постійно боятись. Життя продовжується.
So you can see there really the central role that housing plays in Ukrainian refugees' lives. And when you think about it, housing is really a central role in all of our lives. Where we live makes such a big difference to our everyday experience, and it's no different for refugees. So it's my privilege to be able to introduce to you the panelists we have here with us today to talk about these issues. First, we have Lilet Bredels, an art historian by trade and director of the Arcus Foundation, who investigates the possible role of architecture and urbanism in post-conflict situations. She's a member of the Urban Coalition for Ukraine, addressing housing needs today and planning for the years ahead. We also have Katarzyna Szubluska, the Senior Advocacy Manager with Habitat for Humanity Poland, which has been instrumental in meeting the immediate housing challenges of today's refugee crisis and also looking longer term for solutions in the future. Unfortunately, due to the rapidly shifting situation on the ground, Siske Clausen was unable to join us today. She's the National Shelter Cluster Coordinator with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees working in Ukraine. But luckily, we were able to connect with her yesterday, and we will share some of her pre-recorded responses later on. Now, our panel is going to be taking questions directly from the audience later in the hour, so please drop your comments and questions in the chat box as we go. You can go ahead and start doing that now, and I will read out those questions to the panelists later on. So Katarzyna, let's start with you. We just watched footage of the hugely important work that Habitat for Humanity and its partners are doing to support resettling refugees from Ukraine. What kind of role do NGOs play here? What role can they play? What role are they playing? And how well has the coordination with authorities been going?
Hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Well, here in Poland and in other neighboring countries as well, civil society, including non-governmental organizations, but also volunteers and just the regular people, played a crucial and incremental role in responding to the current crisis. Within the first day after the war in Ukraine escalated and people started coming to Poland, without volunteers on the ground, without NGOs, without organizations, the response would be very, very difficult. So everyone joined forces and everyone played together to support whoever was coming and to support local authorities and others responding to the crisis. So just to give you an example, you all probably know that solidarity housing, so hosting people from Ukraine in our own houses, was one of the biggest and mostly used ways of supporting people. According to UNHCR's report, Lives on Hold, in the entire CE region, in all of the neighboring countries, around 72% of refugees were staying in a hosted or rented accommodation. Here in Warsaw, we see in reports that around 47 people coming from Ukraine stayed with other people, either with friends or with strangers, with hosting families. And it was for free, and another 13% stayed with other people for a fee. So it shows how big support people offered. And you should all know that in Poland, we are struggling with housing crisis for many years now. And one of the biggest challenges that we are facing is overcrowding. So it shows how big support and how great hearts people had just to invite even more people to already overcrowded apartments here in Warsaw. Without non-governmental organizations, without volunteers, without civil society, the response would be very, very difficult. So, for example, what Habitat Poland did here in Warsaw and in the Silesia region, where we also operate in Poland, we supported the local authorities from Warsaw in matching the refugees with the hosting families, offering their rooms or apartments. And we had a special point at the train station, so whoever came to the station was directed straight to the host family. And this way we helped over 700 people, but it was also, of course, not enough, so we also started renting rooms at hotels, mostly hostels, to provide support also to bigger groups, because when housing family offered only one room, it was too small for a bigger group or bigger family traveling together. That's why we started renting also additional rooms. And this way we helped over 1,500 people. And moreover, we converted, you can see this in the photos, office space in one of the buildings in Warsaw to a small 7 rooms for few families that can stay there for short-term accommodation. And apart from that, we are running social rental program. We already did it before the war, and since late February, early March this year, we shifted this to support people coming from Ukraine to Poland. We rent flats on the private market. As it was mentioned, the prices are growing and it's really difficult to find available offers. The market is saturated, but we are still using our qualified and very, very good at their work colleagues who find additional apartments, rent those, and we sub-rent those to the refugees. Thanks to the support of our partners and donors, we are able also to provide financial subsidies to people that we support with housing and with some additional services like language courses or additional support to help them to make it on their feet and to start their lives here in Poland for the time that they want to spend here to make their situation better. And so our colleagues in other countries in our region, in Hungary, in Romania, in Slovakia, they are also helping refugees coming to their countries in very similar ways, supporting people on the border, providing with in-kind donations, helping collective centers, and in the end focusing on more durable housing solutions. Because for us in Habitat, the safe, durable housing, decent housing is one of the most important things. So my short answer would be that NGOs and volunteers and civil society played a crucial role in this response.
Thanks, Katarzyna. It's interesting that you mention how this kind of overlaps with a general housing shortage and the complications that can result from that. We'll be coming back to that a little bit later in the discussion. Lila, let's turn to you next. I know that you and your team are working to address the immediate needs of people displaced inside Ukraine and also in the wider region. And in addition, you're considering the long-term needs for rebuilding. Can you talk to us about the differences in types of rebuilding needs and support based on the community's proximity to the front lines of the war?
Yes, hello. Thanks for the question and the invitation to be here. They are indeed very different depending on where you are. There are, of course, we make a distinction of 4 different places. One is, you could say, behind the front line, in that sense that it's occupied territory right now. But we are still working there. I'll come back to that later. Then you have places that are practically on the front line where there is enormous destruction has been going on. And there is practically nothing of a city heart still standing. And you have places where it's mainly infrastructure. It's a little bit farther away where there have been bombings and destruction going on, but not in huge areas of the town. And there can be done a lot of rebuilding, but the damage is mostly there to infrastructural facilities. And then the last part that we're working on, the cities are really far from the front, and they are mainly dealing with the IDPs that you have been mentioning in the beginning, which are indeed about 6 million. So those places are flooded with refugees. They still always on the threat of the war coming to that place as well. So they have to take care a lot of safety. So apart from the differences, the difficulties that were just mentioned for neighboring countries, they have an extra one that they can be still under threat. So on all those different levels, there are very different reactions that could be made. And what we are doing there, we have a team of experts in very different fields, from urbanists, architects, but also more people from conflict studies, people who are dealing with energy, very important aspect of it, renewable energy systems, small grid energy systems. And they are being asked, so most of the work we do is that we're being asked from locals, so most of the time from mayors from different cities who are on those different, let's say, distance from the front, and therefore different stages of destruction or different problems they have to deal with. So that means the reaction is quite different. If we go first back to this first stage of occupied territory, what people ask there is for a broader master plan, for a bigger vision on what can be done if it is again in Ukrainian hands, and if they can start thinking about taking their city back. So we make their broader plans. When I say we, I mentioned already international team, but I think what is very important there is that half of the team are Ukrainians. So there's the local knowledge is very much embedded in the team, and we think that is very important to do so. So therefore we make the broader master plans. When there are cities that are have been destroyed a lot, there is of course an urgent need for housing, for bringing back people to places to live, and that has another approach. It is a more urgent approach for maybe temporary housing, but at the same time thinking about creating on the longer term a new city. A lot of mayors say that city has to be drastically different than the city they had before, because there's such a different situation going on now in terms of relationship with neighbors and in terms of also energy supply, which is a huge aspect of this. So in the teams, they're always from the very beginning, the new forms of energy supply are being embedded in those projects and those programs. The third one, where it's only about the infrastructure, that's basically the same what I said before about the energy. But what is there also important to think of, that there might be an urgent need, for instance, in water supply or electricity supply. But we think a lot on how to do that and create this fast, let's say, plug-in into a system that functions because people need it now. But at the same time, thinking on the longer term, are we going to build exactly what was before, or does it need to be replaced or with other kind of sources? And how can we do that now temporarily, but at the same time looking at the longer term? So all the time, these time frames are very important to take in consideration at the same time, to work in parallel, let's say. And then coming to the last one, the IDP housing in mainly, of course, the west of Ukraine. That is an extremely urgent need, and there are a couple of projects we're working on, but maybe we can go to that later and leave it there for now.
Thanks, Leland. So I know both of you have been very involved in the housing issue for a long time, but of course we know this is an unprecedented situation here in Europe, and so unprecedented situations often mean you have to come up with unprecedented solutions. So I wonder if you both are seeing new and innovative approaches for the new kinds of problems we're seeing right now with this specific situation. Katarzyna, what about you? What kinds of innovative approaches are you using to address the unique needs of Ukrainian families in this conflict?
Yeah, I think we are coming back to something that we've already mentioned, that the current situation builds on the crisis, the housing crisis that we already had in Poland, and makes more visible the difficulties and challenges that we're facing in our housing market and ecosystem in Poland. That's why we use the solutions that we already developed and started implementing even before the war in Ukraine escalated. So, for example, social rental program, we've been running this since 2017. We started this as a pilot, the first project of this type in Poland back then, and it proved very useful. So the model basically brings together organization who rents apartment on the private market, usually, and then subrents the apartment to the people in housing need. Then, once we tested the model, we realized that it's really supporting families not only in terms of housing, but also in terms of their position on the employment market and access to services, and even income criterion was higher in the research that and the surveys that we conducted with our clients in the project. That's why we realized that this is a useful and good solution that we could use in Poland to support both the vulnerable groups, but also the people falling into so-called friend gap. And that's why we started advocacy on the model. And right now the model is already in Polish legislation, and every city in Poland can start its own social rental agency. But with the current crisis and the influx of people from Ukraine, if we had social rental agencies in every Polish city, or at least the biggest Polish cities, that would be really useful to support people from Ukraine here and now. Unfortunately, this hasn't happened for the last over a year now since we have this legislation in place. That's why we feel the need to supporting local authorities in starting and using this model. Apart from that, another innovative solution that could be used would be renovations of empty spaces. In Poland, Polish cities or municipalities own over 70,000 empty premises that could be renovated and used for housing purposes and to increase affordable housing stock in country. That's why we act as a facilitator. We would like to bring together local authorities, private sector, and make some adaptations, renovations to use those premises for housing purposes. And we also advocate for this model and promote it with local authorities, with national government in Poland, but also with partners who would be interested in implementing this in other parts of Poland. But as you mentioned, this is the time when we can look for very, very new solutions, and seeing how we have changed dynamics in cooperation in Poland. Like private sector is really interested in doing something more social and supporting people who have housing needs. We feel that this is the moment when we can think about bigger partnerships and projects that would bring along various stakeholders, intersectoral stakeholders, to look into more long-term projects with increasing affordable housing stock in Poland.
Lilith, what about you? What kinds of new and innovative approaches are you using now that you weren't necessarily using before?
Yeah, I think it's very much in line to what Katarzyna just mentioned, and both points you mentioned, Katarzyna, I think super important to implement. So the first one you mentioned indeed is regulations, local regulations, and the regulations that have already been implemented in Poland should also be implemented in Ukraine very quickly. So we are working a lot on talking to local but also the national government to implement social rental systems, and they can be different systems. It's not just one. that is not in place at the moment, and that is very important for the future of the housing in Ukraine, and to do that social and sustainable. The second one that we are working on right now is what we call Kohati, and that is indeed working on buildings that are being derelict right now. They're empty. And being renovated fastly and cheaply. So there are, for us, really new systems of doing it with locals and with also refugee communities to, for instance, there have been flats out in Ivano-Frankivsk, now 3 buildings from the municipality. They created the availability. There have been fundraising around some very local organizations, and for 40,000 euro only in 6 weeks, an old building was being renovated for IDP housing of 180 people, so that's quite a lot. Now we're working on the 4th building. One is a hotel, one is an old kindergarten, and the 4th one I forgot what it was before, but they are being renovated in a very basic way to have it fast, not too expensive, but readily available. And indeed, and I think that is very important, with local involvement, because if that is not the case, then very often people don't feel integrated, they are not being part of the society. And we try to do that in smaller communities and with not huge amount of people altogether. And I think that also could be different than in previous crises, where housing for refugees was always in those huge chunks, these huge refugee centers where people are being crammed all together and being also an invasion, let's say, for local communities, whether that is in another country or even in your own country. Because even when we talk about internally displaced people, still it is a lot of, let's say, foreigners that are welcomed in the very beginning, but if the situation takes on a little bit longer and there is this housing crisis locally, there is an employment crisis, then still new people, they give a huge pressure on that social situation. So you have to make sure that the amounts are in, let's say, relation to the local community, and that there is an involvement from the very beginning onwards, that everybody is feeling welcome, but also the other way around, that there is some mutual collectivity, let's say, in building it. That is one more thing to add, and that has to do again with the first laws and regulations, the way of housing, and that is that we're working a lot on cooperative housing as well. So renting places together with a group of people, or even ownership. So that are the systems we're working on at the moment.
Yeah, as you mentioned, in a situation where resources are scarce, whether it be housing resources, energy resources, it can cause friction with the local population, and that's obviously not a situation you want to get into. Just a reminder for those of you at home, you can enter your questions to the panelists by entering them there on your screen. I'll see them here and I can read them out in a bit. But before we move to audience questions, I'd like to share the pre-recorded responses that Siske provided, particularly focused on the UNHCR's response efforts and the challenges around navigating the rapidly shifting situation. So let's go ahead and play that video now.
Yes, so let me start with 2 to 3 weeks ago. We had a scenario that everyone was quite optimistic, uplifted and happy to see progress on the eastern side with newly liberated areas. So all our focus was actually drawn towards the eastern part and Dnipro and Donetsk and Luhansk, those areas just before the referenda. And we were actually hoping, especially in the western part, Lviv, Kiev, that we would be free and in free of those air raids and airstrikes as well. So our scenario was much more focused on rebuilding, reconstruction, and helping those that were affected prior to last 2 weeks to support them with the repair work on their damaged houses. Instead, we're now seeing that this is a very different scenario at the moment. It's very unpredictable. Air strikes can hit in the west, in the north, in the south, in the east, everywhere, meaning that scenario planning on where it's safe is very, very different. Maybe airstrikes will not happen every day, but the impact is great in terms of movements, restrictions, in terms of electricity, in terms of water, in terms of access to internet, a lot of infrastructural disruptions that makes it very, very unpredictable, and makes travels much more complicated, meaning that buses, trains that are functioning well are not allowed to be taken by us because the risks are too high and it's too unpredictable what will happen the next day. We're using a system whereby on the Polish side in Rzeszów and then on the other side in Lviv, there's a shuttle bus going every 2 days of the week or 3 days, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday now, to make sure that we can make these movements. But then if you want to travel onwards from Lviv to Vinnytsia, to Kiev, to Odessa, everything needs to be done by car. Fuel prices are very high, so it's very, very costly. And it also consumes a lot of time. Like, you can't travel by night, so you need to travel during the daytime. So you're losing working hours, which means that everything becomes much more complicated in terms of preparation, in terms of the actual travel days, and in terms of reaching where you would like to be. So I think you would see like a shift in more meetings being either being ad hoc, being either online or hybrid, which was the case before, and now this will return in this way, which is a pity because you lose the actual touch with the beneficiaries, with the local authorities, being able to talk to partners, to be able to walk around. Everything is much more planned, and ad hoc trips are becoming more cumbersome also because of the winter coming up. I think there are a couple things that are becoming more and more complicated. On the one hand, those organizations that would like to implement projects will face difficulties getting material from abroad inside. Wood prices are increasing, fuel prices are increasing. I mean, wood in terms of construction material is limited. You would see that warehouses become empty during the winter because maybe everything is already being used and supported in the beginning in newly liberated areas, but the important point is that being able to restock will become more complicated. Getting visas will become more complicated. Other logistical challenges will remain but become more difficult. Roads become more complicated. The country is huge, so distances even within the east can easily take one trip can take you a day. So let alone that you need to get some items from the other part of the country will take a couple days or weeks, which means that the response will slow down, in terms of construction, in terms of shelter activities, in terms of insulation works, in terms of house repairs, in terms of windows, doors, and so on in collective centers, will become more of a challenge in terms of implementation. It will take longer to construct. It will longer to maintain certain running costs in certain collective centers. I think you would see a shift in those areas where a lot of attention is drawn towards, versus those collective sites that are in parts of the country that there's less of a focus, and we simply don't know who's there to support. if there are a lot of people arriving, how long they will be staying, are there people with a disability that have special needs or should get additional support. It will become more complicated to reach those that are in need of dire humanitarian response. And in terms of shelter is repair work, but it's also emergency shelter kits, it's also NFI kits, thinking of winterization, thinking of fuel support. I think you would see a shift and possibly a lot of people moving to from the east towards the west or the central region, just trying to find shelter, trying to find a place to stay where it's a little warmer, where there's access to fuel, where there's access to rental support, where there's access to different facilities. So there's a lot of things changing all at the same time, and it's beyond the capacities, I think, of the shelter cluster with more than 100 partners to respond, and even it's beyond the capacities of the government to support their oblast authorities. I think it's a challenge for everyone, every cluster, and we're running against time. Basically, winter can start every day now. The temperature is dropping, and we don't have the answer to all those issues at hand. So it's a very remarkable place where there's a lot of support, self-help. People start the repair work, but on the other hand, the damages are very extensive. A lot of areas are not accessible yet, so we don't know yet what to expect. We don't know how much repair work should be done. Some repair work can only be done in April when the winter is over. So there's a lot of things at stake. There's a lot of money coming in, let's say, through different channels, but the time, the resources, the capacity of partners, the capacity of the humanitarian sector is not at a level that we can say we're fully prepared. Yeah, not an easy question. So the answer would be like, we really need to understand what we need to do and where. So meaning we need to have a good understanding of the extent of the damages, the extent of the capacities of the partners, what they can deliver, what the government can deliver. We need to make sure that we have access to every beneficiary to be able to provide them what they need. But that means also that we need to plan for different scenarios. So one of the scenarios is that more liberated areas will mean more access to different vulnerable groups. But also it could be leading to more airstrikes, meaning that there's more damages to houses. Another scenario is still not unlikely that there will be at some point a nuclear attack or like something that we need to prepare and plan for as well. Then of course we need to think ahead of winter and what that means. If people are not being able to move, if they cannot move from their houses, do we want to support them in rural areas? Do we want to focus there? Do we need to reach out to the private sector? Do we need to reach out to the government? Do we need to work with the Red Cross? Do we need to actually make sure that we have a very clear understanding that those most vulnerable people, elderly, young people with families with children, they have access to education, to public services, that there's a referral system in place. There are different ways that you can support. Short fixes can be done easily, but ultimately what I think should be happening is already now we need to think of a scenario in 6 months time or 12 months where we need to find a way where those displaced have a permanent solution for their house. The temporary fixes are good now for pure survival for the winter months, but I think it's already the time now to think ahead. What will happen next year? What will happen the year after? How much can be reconstructed? How much do we need to rebuild? Where do we want to rebuild it? What facilities are needed? Where would like people feel safe? Where would they like to stay? Is that the border areas? Is that somewhere else? Is it Odessa? Is it what infrastructure do you need for this? Who should be supporting who? is our role limited to only 6 months or 12 months, or should we see how much capacity we can bring to the local partners that will stay there for much longer? So I think there are two ways we need to think about now, and we need to think about the next years ahead. If we don't do it, we create a situation that people stay in collective centers and will not feel safe, will not have a home, will not move out because they don't have the means to move out. So I think this is the message, that it's really focused now on day-to-day survival, but I think at the same time we need to already think ahead.
It's a very interesting point that Siske brings up there at the end, that some of these solutions that are being devised right now are obviously not meant long term. And if we don't think about the long term, those what are meant to be temporary solutions become long-term solutions. You see that happen a lot with refugee situations. Katarzyna, I'd be interested to get your reaction to what Siske was saying about the importance of managing immediate needs at the same time as looking ahead to longer recovery efforts, particularly regarding adequate shelter.
Well, I couldn't agree more with this statement, and it's the same here in Poland. Once we respond to the current situation, I mean national government, local authorities, civil society, non-governmental organizations, we should already plan next steps, and the next steps should allow for transition from temporary solutions, from collective centers to more durable housing solutions. But we know that here in Poland and in Ukraine, even more difficult it will be to create those solutions that will support everyone, both refugees from Ukraine, but also Polish host community, because as we mentioned before, the housing was difficult ecosystem here in Poland, even before the war in Ukraine started. So definitely the first step, temporary solutions, then and supporting people on the move, because in the neighboring countries, we see a lot of people coming, for example, to the biggest cities and then transferring to other countries or other cities in the country. So the first step, the first response to support people within those days when they come. Then the next step, more medium-term solutions, and then long-term durable housing solutions that will allow those who would like to stay here in Poland to start their lives and integrate and live comfortably here in Poland. And I feel that this might be really challenging for us to act now and also plan and start implement planning for the next phases and next steps.
Lila, another theme that Siske was talking about there is the energy security situation. We know that energy security is now at the top of European leaders' agenda, and right now we have this very important meeting of EU energy ministers happening in Prague as we speak. The energy crisis is already here, and it's affecting everybody, people who live in all types of housing, not just refugees. And the situation is particularly difficult in Central and Eastern Europe, where the dependence on Russian energy is so high, and that also happens to be the geographic area that's receiving the largest number of Ukrainian refugees. So Lila, what do you think can be done to help communities on the ground ensure that everyone has a decent heated place to live, and that you don't get one community thinking another is being advantaged with more heat than they have?
Yeah, super important issue indeed, and not an easy one. It is, of course, the energy crisis is everywhere a problem. In this situation there, what we try to do as much as possible is work with local communities, and it is partly municipalities, but also there's gathered group of community leaders, and that it has a whole network throughout the whole Ukraine. Those community leaders, they think together about how to deal with those energy issues. And one possibility we're working on now is that within a community there is the lead is the municipality, and that creates a kind of off-grid small energy. It's not off-grid, I say that wrongly. It's a hybrid system where there is an energy supply with solar and or heat from the earth heat in, for instance, a school, in a public building. So it can be the school, it can be the hospital, it can be a church, it can be a central public building that serves then as a supplier for houses around it. So it is basically small energy, how do you call it, centrales? My English is lacking me. Energy supply systems for smaller communities. So that is one element we're working on there, so that private owners as well as rental corporations can plug into that system and therefore have that done as very low cost. So that is one thing that we are working on at the moment, and working very hard together with those local community leaders. There's one thing I would like to add also into what Sietke was mentioning, if that is okay for you, David. And that is that mentioning indeed of the longer term, which I think is very crucial. And what I noticed so much, we were at a World Urban Forum. There were a lot of mayors and urban planners and civil servants from all those different communities and villages and smaller cities that were themselves so aware and mentioning all the time the question, how should our city look like? How can we rebuild it for the longer term? So they were really not only thinking about short-term solutions or doing something for the now, but they were really thinking, if we are not going to rebuild our city as an attractive city, as an energy sufficient city, but also a social sustainable city with a lot of green and with lots of employment, with all kind of possibilities for people to build there, to want to live there. A lot of people who left our city now, they will not come back. So they will stay in diaspora, they will stay in other countries in Europe. And if we want to have them back, we better build good, we better build back better, as the slogan is then. But they really mean it, and they really take that into consideration when they're making their new plans. And I think that is indeed, I can only emphasize it again, what Sietke said and Katarzyna as well, of highest importance to think on this longer term, also in terms of employment, so that we are not going to focus now completely on, for instance, the Western Park, where you can start thinking of building new kind of industries to supply employment, which is a nice idea. But if you don't counterpart it immediately with plans for the eastern part, then you will get an internally unequal situation in the future.
Well, let's go to the questions that have come in from the audience. First question that's come in is for Katarzyna. The question is, many refugees from Ukraine living in neighboring countries want to go back to Ukraine. How can Habitat and other NGOs support planning with more solid long-term shelter solutions?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people, and we hear that also from our clients, they would like to go back to Ukraine, and especially elderly people. They don't imagine themselves starting a life in a different country, and they are only here for short time, making sure that, they would really like to make sure that they will go back to Ukraine. And from Habitat for Humanity perspective, well, our main focus is to support people of Ukraine, both those who have fled and those who are still in the country, in access to suitable, safe, affordable shelter and housing options so that they are all able to live with dignity. And we are going to support also people in Ukraine, and our work in Ukraine will focus on providing support to households to repair, to reinforce damaged houses, and to support energy efficient rehabilitation of multi-apartment buildings and basement and shelters. So this is also going to the energy issue. And our initial efforts in Ukraine will be focused on supporting people to better cope with the winter that is coming and the harsh conditions that they will probably face. So we are exploring a number of partnerships, and we are currently going to sign a partnership agreement with Catholic Relief Services, and we are also in conversations with a number of other partners. So in the long term, Habitat is very committed to supporting the reconstruction of Ukraine based on our global and our regional expertise, and including supporting national and local authorities and governments to develop affordable housing initiatives, solutions, including municipal housing, social housing that will support people also in the long term.
The next question is for Lilith. It's back to this issue of cooperation with authorities. So the question is, with winter coming and increasing energy costs, are countries in the region prepared to handle another influx of refugees from Ukraine? So again, like I was saying at the beginning, we are possibly looking at another wave. From your vantage point, are the countries in the region ready?
Wow, that's a difficult question. And I don't think I have the correct answer for that. We are very much focusing in Ukraine itself and not so much in the region. So I think Katarzyna is much more fit to answer that question because she is in the neighboring country and I'm from the Netherlands. So maybe
yeah, sure. Go ahead,
Katarzyna.
Yeah, so it's again a difficult question also for people who are in the neighboring countries.
Yeah, of
so
course. Sorry for that.
We don't, no problem. But we are asking this question to ourselves every day. Are we ready? And what we will do, we as organization, we as one of the partners of UNHCR in the shelter working group, and other organizations are asking the same questions, local authorities, national authorities. Because definitely we expect a new influx of people. We've been expecting that since August already, knowing that winter will come and the infrastructure in Ukraine is destroyed, and some people may choose to leave Ukraine for the winter time at least. And but right now, with the current situation in Ukraine and the recent bombings and situation, we know that the influx may be even bigger and higher. So definitely, this is a difficult question, but one, we have already some solutions in place, some coordination in place. It's still a lot way before us to make this system more effective, but something is already ready. And we have a lot of organizations operating. We have established cooperations between international agendas, local organizations, authorities, to try to be better prepared. So I think from my perspective, the answer is we know what is there to be done, and we know how we should be prepared, and we are in the process of getting prepared, but definitely we are not in the end of this process yet.
Well, I have a final question here for Lilith. So the question is, in your view, what kind of support is needed from the global community to support refugees, IDPs, and host communities this winter? What would you really like to see, particularly from global organizations, that would help the situation?
Yeah, I would really support, I would say really support the locals. The more people that can stay in the countries, the better. So I would say most efforts and most support systems should be implemented in the country itself in the first place. Apart from, of course, that the global community should do a lot, as Poland is doing now in their own countries to host the refugees that are at their doorsteps, which I think is an only logical and human thing that we should do. And I could say to my own government in the Netherlands, we could step up, in my view, a little bit more on that aspect. But to help people on the ground through the winter, I think the global community also needs to step up a little bit more. There is already a lot of support going on, but that should go directly to organizations in the country who are working very hard. And that is a combination of national government, but also the local governments and people working on the more local level who really know what are the needs on the ground. So my main thing is listen to people from the Ukraine and their questions.
Katarzyna, same question to you. And if you could ask for one thing from the global community to help the situation on the ground in terms of refugee housing, what would it be?
Well, I would say that definitely we need know-how, we need support, we need help. But I agree with Lila that there are people here on the ground who know what they need, and we need to listen to them. But we also need coordination and support to establish the effective systems to support people who are facing housing, educational, integrational issues here in neighboring countries.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's panel. I want to thank our two live panelists here, Katarzyna and Lilit, for some really interesting insights into the situation that we're facing, and also Siska for the pre-recorded responses to the questions. That's really useful, I think, both to know what's happening on the ground, but also to know what's happening on the macro level. This is a situation, as we know, that is not going away. And as we go to these very difficult winter months ahead, months that are going to be difficult for everyone, not just Ukrainian refugees, it'll be really key, as we were talking about, to think about the long-term plan here. This has been a really compelling conversation, and I think it's important to continue this dialogue in the coming months as we face whatever we may be facing in the coming months, as things remain unpredictable and unclear. For anyone interested in learning more about what Habitat for Humanity is doing in this region in terms of housing, you can visit habitat.org and find out what's going on and how you can contribute. But for now, I thank you all for spending your afternoon with us, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Take care.